Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives, where tonight we're venturing into one of Southeast Asia's most quietly extraordinary places. Laos, a landlocked nation that once boldly called itself the land of a million elephants, though I suspect no one actually counted them. That would have been quite the census job. Tucked between Vietnam's bustling energy and Thailand's tourist crowds, Laos has somehow managed to preserve something increasingly rare in our modern world: genuine tranquility. This is a country where Buddhist monks still collect alms at dawn, where the Mekong River flows like liquid history, and where ancient kingdoms once commanded respect across Southeast Asia with their impressive elephant armies, or at least their impressive elephant marketing. Tonight, we'll uncover how this seemingly peaceful nation survived French colonizers, became the most heavily bombed country in history, and somehow emerged as one of the region's hidden gems. From the golden temples of Luang Prabang to the mysterious Plain of Jars, this is a story of resilience, adaptation, and the occasional diplomatic elephant. If you find yourself drifting off to these tales of kingdoms and quiet revolutions, hit that subscribe button, because frankly, we could all use more peaceful history in our lives. Now, let's discover why the land of a million elephants might just be Southeast Asia's best-kept secret. Chapter 1. Land of a Million Elephants: Geography and Early Foundations. Picture, if you will, a country that looks like someone took a piece of modelling clay and stretched it north to south, then squeezed it just a bit in the middle. That's Laos for you. A beautifully elongated nation that stretches for over 1,000 kilometres from top to bottom. Yet at its narrowest point, you could drive across it in about an hour if you didn't stop for snacks. Which, let's be honest, you probably would. Laos sits comfortably landlocked in the heart of Southeast Asia, surrounded by 5 neighbours who probably all have strong opinions about the proper way to make sticky rice. To the north and northwest, China looms large with its vast territories. Moving clockwise, Vietnam hugs the long eastern border like a protective older sibling. Cambodia provides a friendly southern boundary, while Thailand wraps around the west and southwest like a warm blanket. And finally, Myanmar, formerly Burma, touches Laos at its northwestern tip, creating what geographers call a quintuple landlocked situation, which sounds far more dramatic than it actually is. The country covers approximately 236,800 square kilometres, making it roughly the size of the United Kingdom, though with significantly fewer queues for tea and considerably more elephants. Well, historically speaking, the million elephants thing was probably more marketing than mathematics, but we'll get to that delightful bit of ancient exaggeration later. Now, let's talk about the star of Laos geography, the mighty Mekong River. This liquid highway flows along much of the western border with Thailand, and if rivers could win personality contests, the Mekong would definitely take home the crown. It's the 12th longest river in the world, and the lifeblood of Southeast Asia, though it has the peculiar habit of changing colours depending on the season. During the dry season, it runs a lovely muddy brown that would make a chocolate milkshake jealous. Come the rainy season, it transforms into something resembling coffee with too much cream. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but absolutely essential for millions of people. The Mekong doesn't just flow past Laos, it practically defines the country. Along its banks, the most fertile land in the nation spreads out in a series of floodplains that have fed Lao people for centuries. These plains are where most Laotians live today, probably because flat, fertile land near fresh water has always been prime real estate, even before real estate agents existed to tell us so. But Laos isn't just river plains and good intentions. The eastern part of the country rises dramatically into the Annamite Range, a mountain chain that sounds like it was named by someone with a stutter, but actually derives from an ancient Chinese term. These mountains form a natural barrier with Vietnam and include some peaks that reach over 2,000 meters high. That might not sound impressive compared to the Himalayas, but remember, this is a country where most people live at river level, so 2,000 meters might as well be Mount Everest with a slight altitude problem. The most famous of these highland areas is the Plain of Jars, which sounds like either an archaeological wonder or the world's most boring kitchen storage solution. Fortunately, it's the former. This mysterious plateau in north-central Laos is dotted with thousands of ancient stone jars, some as tall as a person and weighing several tons. No one knows exactly who made them or why, though theories range from ancient burial practices to really ambitious pickle storage. The leading archaeological theory suggests they were part of Bronze Age funeral rituals, which makes them significantly more interesting than pickle storage, though arguably less practical. Moving south, we encounter the Bolaven Plateau, a highland region that sits about 1,000 meters above sea level and apparently decided it wanted to be the coffee capital of Laos. The volcanic soil and cooler temperatures create perfect conditions for growing coffee beans, which the French colonial administrators discovered with the enthusiasm of people who really needed their morning caffeine fix. Today, Lao coffee is considered some of the finest in Southeast Asia, though it's still working on its international recognition. It's the underdog of the coffee world, excellent quality, but needs better marketing. The climate of Laos follows the typical Southeast Asian pattern of hot and wet, or hot and dry, depending on which monsoon happens to be visiting at the time. The southwest monsoon brings the rainy season from May to October, dumping enormous amounts of water on a landscape that responds by turning every possible shade of green. It's during this time that the Mekong swells to impressive proportions, and rice farmers across the country perform their annual dance of celebration mixed with mild anxiety about flooding. The dry season, running from November to April, sees temperatures that can make you question your life choices, particularly in the lowlands where it can reach 40 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to fry an egg on the sidewalk, assuming you can find a sidewalk and happen to have an egg handy. Most sensible people retreat to air conditioning or the mountains during the hottest months, though the mountains come with their own challenges, like the occasional tiger who's also seeking cooler temperatures. Speaking of wildlife, Laos was once genuinely teeming with exotic animals. Tigers, leopards, Asian elephants, sun bears, and countless species of birds called this land home. The elephant population was indeed substantial, though whether it ever reached the legendary million is doubtful. Elephants require enormous amounts of food and space, and even at its peak, Laos probably couldn't have supported quite that many. But land of several thousand elephants doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? The forests of Laos were equally impressive. Dense tropical rainforests covered much of the country, home to valuable hardwoods like teak and mahogany. These forests provided everything from building materials to medicinal plants, creating a natural pharmacy that traditional healers still draw upon today. The trees also helped regulate the climate and prevent erosion, performing all sorts of environmental services without sending a bill, which is remarkably considerate of them. Now, let's venture back in time to explore how humans first discovered this rather pleasant corner of the world. Archaeological evidence suggests that people have been living in what is now Laos for thousands of years, though they probably called it something entirely different and had no idea they were establishing the foundations for a future tourist destination. The earliest inhabitants were likely related to the Austroasiatic peoples, who had the good sense to settle near rivers and practice agriculture when hunting and gathering became too much like hard work. They developed sophisticated irrigation systems and began cultivating rice, which would become the foundation of Lao cuisine and culture. Rice farming is more complex than it appears. It requires precise water management, timing, and community cooperation. It's basically ancient engineering with more mud and fewer safety regulations. By around the first millennium CE, various small kingdoms and principalities had emerged across the region. These early political entities had names that sound like they were created by a fantasy novelist with a fondness for the letter K, kingdoms like Chenla and various Khmer successor states. They built temples, established trade routes, and engaged in the timeless political activities of forming alliances, breaking alliances, and arguing about borders. The influence of Indian culture arrived through trade and religious missions, bringing with it Buddhism and Hinduism. Buddhism, in particular, would become deeply embedded in Lao culture, though it underwent some interesting local adaptations. Lao Buddhism developed its own characteristics, blending Theravada Buddhist teachings with animist beliefs that had existed long before any monks arrived with their philosophical discussions about suffering and enlightenment. Temples, or wats as they're known locally, began appearing across the landscape. These weren't just places of worship, but served as community centres, schools, and repositories of knowledge. Monks became the educated class, responsible for literacy, medicine, and maintaining the calendar, which was more complicated than you might think when you're trying to coordinate religious festivals with agricultural cycles and the occasional royal wedding. Trade routes developed along the Mekong and through the mountain passes, connecting Laos to the broader world of Southeast Asian commerce. Merchants carried goods between China and the kingdoms to the south, turning Laos into a natural stopping point for anyone who needed to rest their oxen and restock their supplies. This geographic position as a crossroads would shape Lao history for centuries to come, usually in ways that involved other people marching through with varying degrees of friendliness. The people who would become known as the Lao began migrating into the region during the medieval period, bringing with them their own languages, customs, and a particular genius for adapting to local conditions. They integrated with existing populations, adopted local agricultural techniques, and began the process of creating a distinct Lao cultural identity that balanced outside influences with homegrown traditions. Village life centered around the rice cycle, with entire communities working together during planting and harvest seasons. Extended families lived in houses built on stilts, a practical design that protected against floods, provided storage space underneath, and offered a nice breeze during the hot season. It was sustainable architecture before sustainability became trendy, designed by people who understood their environment intimately and built accordingly. Social organisation was relatively egalitarian by medieval standards, though like everywhere else, some people ended up with more land and influence than others. Village elders made important decisions collectively, consulting with everyone who had a stake in the outcome. It was democracy with Lao characteristics, less formal than what we might recognise today, but probably more effective at ensuring everyone had enough rice to eat. The spiritual world of early Laos was remarkably inclusive. Buddhism provided the major philosophical framework, but local spirits, called Phi, continued to play important roles in daily life. Every village had its guardian spirits, every house had its protective deities, and every significant natural feature had its own spiritual resident who needed to be treated with appropriate respect. It was a crowded supernatural landscape, but apparently everyone got along reasonably well. Festivals developed around both Buddhist holy days and agricultural cycles, creating a calendar packed with celebrations that gave people regular excuses to stop working and enjoy life. The most important of these was Pai Mai, the Lao New Year, which involves copious amounts of water throwing and is either the world's largest water fight or a profound spiritual cleansing ritual, depending on your perspective and how wet you are at the time. By the 13th century, the stage was set for the emergence of something grander than scattered villages and minor kingdoms. The Mongol Empire was reshaping Asia, trade was flourishing, and various ambitious leaders were looking around and thinking, you know what this region needs? Proper political organization, and possibly a really good origin story involving elephants. The land that would become Laos was ready for its moment in history, complete with all the elements necessary for kingdom building. Fertile river valleys, strategic location, skilled agriculturalists, and enough local rulers with competing ambitions to make politics interesting. All it needed was the right person with sufficient vision, political skill, and the ability to convince people that uniting under one banner was better than continuing to argue about rice field boundaries. That person was waiting in the wings, about to create a kingdom that would not only claim ownership of 1 million elephants, but would also establish a cultural and political legacy that endures to this day. But that, as they say in the history business, is a story for our next section. As you drift off tonight, imagine those ancient villages along the Mekong, where people lived in harmony with the seasonal rhythms of the river, where spirits shared the landscape with humans, and where someone, somewhere, was probably exaggerating about the number of elephants they'd seen that day. Chapter 2. The Rise of Lan Xang Kingdom. Various small kingdoms scattered like puzzle pieces across the landscape, waiting for someone ambitious enough to put them all together. That someone turned out to be a man with quite possibly the most compelling backstory in medieval Southeast Asian history, and trust me, that's saying something in a region where royal genealogies read like soap opera scripts. Meet Chow Fa Ngum, born in the year 1316 in the Principality of Muang Sua, which would later become the famous royal city of Luang Prabang. Now, Fa Ngum's entry into the world was apparently accompanied by some rather dramatic omens. According to Lao chronicles, he was born with 33 teeth, which sounds uncomfortable for everyone involved and was interpreted as a sign that he might pose a threat to his grandfather's kingdom. What we do know is that Fa Ngum's grandfather, King Suvarna Kamphong, decided that having a potentially troublesome grandson around wasn't worth the risk. Some sources suggest it was actually Fa Ngum's father who caused the family drama by becoming inappropriately involved with one of the king's concubines, which, let's be honest, was probably a more common reason for royal exile than having too many teeth. Either way, young Fa Ngum and his father found themselves politely asked to leave the kingdom permanently. This turned out to be one of history's more fortuitous banishments, because the family fled south to the magnificent Khmer Empire centered at Angkor. Now, Angkor in the early 14th century was like the Harvard of Southeast Asian kingdoms. If you were going to get exiled anywhere, this was definitely the place to end up. The Khmer court was sophisticated, wealthy, and politically complex, offering young Fa Ngum an education in statecraft that his rural principality never could have provided. The Khmer king, Jayavarman IX, took a liking to the exiled Lao prince and essentially adopted him as a son. This wasn't just royal charity. The Khmers were pragmatic rulers who understood the value of having friendly client states on their periphery. By grooming Fa Ngum for eventual leadership, they were investing in future regional stability and trade relationships. Fa Ngum threw himself into court life with enthusiasm, learning everything from military strategy to administrative techniques. He also married Princess Keo Kenkanya, a Khmer royal who would play a crucial role in the religious transformation of his future kingdom. The marriage was politically advantageous, but by all accounts, it was also a genuine love match. which was a pleasant bonus in an age when royal marriages were typically about as romantic as trade agreements. Meanwhile, back in the lands of his birth, the political situation was becoming increasingly chaotic. The death of Sukhotai's powerful king Ram Khamhaeng had left a power vacuum, and various small kingdoms and principalities were asserting their independence or being absorbed by their neighbours. It was the kind of political instability that ambitious exiles dream about, the perfect opportunity for a comeback story. In 1349, when Fa Ngum was 33 years old, King Jayavarman granted him something that would change the course of Southeast Asian history, an army. Not just any army, but a force of 10,000 Khmer troops, complete with elephants, cavalry, and all the military technology that the advanced Khmer Empire could provide. It was like being given the keys to a medieval tank division. Along with this generous military loan, the Khmer king provided Fa Ngum with what would become the spiritual symbol of his future kingdom, the Prabang Buddha image. This wasn't just any religious statue. It was a golden Buddha studded with emeralds, crafted in Sri Lanka and considered one of the most sacred Buddhist artifacts in Southeast Asia. Having the Prabang was like carrying a divine endorsement for his political ambitions. Fa Ngum's military campaign began in earnest around 1350, and it was a masterclass in medieval conquest strategy. Rather than simply marching straight toward his homeland and hoping for the best, he systematically worked his way through the river valleys, conquering and consolidating territories along the route. Each victory added to his forces as local rulers either joined him voluntarily or contributed troops after being defeated. The young conqueror demonstrated a remarkable talent for reading the political landscape. He understood that successful empire building required more than military might. It needed legitimacy, local support, and practical administrative solutions. So he made strategic alliances, respected local customs where possible, and presented himself not as a foreign invader, but as a rightful ruler returning to claim his inheritance. His first major victory came against the Principality of Champasak in southern Laos. The rulers there had been struggling with their own succession disputes and internal conflicts, making them vulnerable to a well-organized external force. Fa Ngum's victory wasn't just military. He incorporated the defeated nobility into his administration and married some of their daughters to his key supporters, weaving together a political network that would outlast any single battle. Moving north, Fa Ngum faced his most emotionally challenging conquest, Muang Sua itself, his birthplace and the seat of his grandfather's power. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. The exiled prince was returning home with a foreign army to claim the throne he'd been denied by birth. It was like a medieval version of that awkward family reunion where you show up more successful than everyone expected, except with war elephants. The siege of Muang Sua was both a military and psychological campaign. Fa Ngum's grandfather was still alive, but clearly outmatched by the professional Khmer army and the coalition of local forces that had joined his grandson's cause. The old king, realizing that resistance was futile and perhaps feeling some familial sentiment, chose not to fight to the bitter end. According to the chronicles, he abdicated rather than see his city destroyed, dying shortly afterward. With Muang Sua secured, Fa Ngum controlled the northern reaches of what would become his kingdom, but he wasn't finished. The most valuable prize was still ahead of him, Vientiane, the great trading city that controlled the central Mekong Valley. Vientiane was wealthy, strategically positioned, and determinedly independent. Taking it would require all of Fa Ngum's political and military skills. The campaign for Vientiane revealed Fa Ngum's evolution from exiled prince to sophisticated ruler. He didn't simply besiege the city. He constructed a careful diplomatic and economic campaign that made resistance seem pointless. He controlled the trade routes, had the support of most surrounding territories, and could offer the city's merchants better protection and opportunities than they enjoyed as an independent state. When Vientiane finally opened its gates in 1356, it was as much economic calculation as military defeat. But Vientiane's submission came with consequences. The powerful Siamese kingdom of Ayutthaya, which had been eyeing the city's wealth for itself, was decidedly unhappy about this new player controlling valuable territory along the Korat Plateau. This led to Lan Xang's first major international crisis, as Fa Ngum found himself facing demands and threats from a kingdom that was considerably larger and more established than his newly unified territories. Fa Ngum's response to the Siamese challenge showed the diplomatic sophistication he'd learnt at the Khmer court. Rather than escalating the conflict into a war that might destroy his nascent kingdom, he negotiated. The result was a treaty that acknowledged Lan Xang's control over its territories while establishing peaceful relations with Ayutthaya. The Siamese king even offered his daughter, Princess Nang Keo Lot Fa, as a second wife to Fa Ngum, a marriage alliance that formalized the new kingdom's international recognition. With external threats managed and internal territories consolidated, Fa Ngum was ready to make his political achievement official. In 1353, he held his coronation ceremony and proclaimed the establishment of Lan Xang Hom Khao, the land of 1,000,000 elephants and the white parasol. The name was brilliantly chosen for its symbolic power. Elephants represented military might and royal authority, while the white parasol was a traditional symbol of Buddhist kingship and divine protection. Now, about those 1,000,000 elephants, this was almost certainly poetic exaggeration rather than a literal count. Even at its peak, Lan Xang probably never had more than a few thousand war elephants, which was still an impressive force by medieval standards. But land of several thousand elephants doesn't have the same inspirational ring, does it? Sometimes effective branding requires a little creative mathematics. The white parasol element of the kingdom's name reflected one of Fa Ngum's most important innovations, the systematic introduction of Theravada Buddhism as the state religion. This wasn't just a spiritual decision, but a masterful political strategy. Buddhism provided a unifying cultural framework that could bridge the ethnic and linguistic differences among his various subject populations. It also connected his kingdom to the broader Buddhist world, establishing trade and diplomatic relationships with other Buddhist kingdoms across Southeast Asia. The introduction of Buddhism to Lan Xang involved more than just royal proclamations. Princess Keo Kenkanya, Fa Ngum's Khmer wife, played a crucial role in this religious transformation. She brought with her not only the knowledge and practices of Khmer Buddhism, but also connections to the scholarly monastic networks that could provide the kingdom with educated monks and religious teachers. Buddhism's establishment in Lan Xang wasn't a simple replacement of existing beliefs. The new religion coexisted with traditional animist practices, creating a distinctly Lao form of Buddhism that incorporated local spirits, or Phi, into its cosmology. This religious syncretism helped ensure that Buddhism was accepted by common people rather than remaining an elite court practice. Under Fa Ngum's rule, Lan Xang quickly established itself as a major regional power. The kingdom stretched from the borders of China in the north to the edges of Cambodia in the south, and from the Annamite Mountains in the east to the Mekong's western banks. It was, by the standards of 14th century Southeast Asia, genuinely massive, roughly equivalent to modern Laos, plus significant portions of northeastern Thailand and parts of Vietnam. The kingdom's economic foundation rested on its control of trade routes along the Mekong River and through the mountain passes. Merchant caravans travelling between China and the southern kingdoms had to pass through Lan Xang territory, providing the royal treasury with substantial customs revenues. The kingdom also developed its own export industries, particularly in precious woods, aromatic resins, and luxury textiles that were highly valued throughout the region. However, Fa Ngum's later years revealed the potential downside of having been raised as a warrior conqueror. The skills that made him successful at building a kingdom, decisiveness, military focus, and an appetite for conflict, weren't necessarily ideal for peacetime governance. By the 1370s, his court was becoming restless with his continued emphasis on military campaigns and his increasingly autocratic behaviour. The king's relationship with his Khmer advisors and supporters also became a source of tension. Many Lao nobles felt that Fa Ngum was giving too much influence to foreign councillors and following Khmer customs at the expense of local traditions. It was the age-old problem of successful conquerors. The very qualities that help you win a kingdom can make it difficult to keep one once the winning is done. In 1373, the court staged what might be diplomatically called an intervention. Fa Ngum was deposed by his own government and sent into exile in the Principality of Nan, in what is now northern Thailand. It was a remarkably civilized coup. No executions, no civil war, just a firm suggestion that the founding father of Lan Xang might enjoy retirement somewhere else. He died in exile sometime between 1373 and 1390. The man chosen to replace Fa Ngum was his own son, Un Hoen, who took the throne name Samson Thai, meaning King of 300,000 Thai. This name was carefully chosen to emphasize his connection to the Lao Thai people, rather than the Khmer influences that had made his father unpopular. It was also based on a census that reported 300,000 men available for military service, which suggests that Lan Xang's population was substantial and well organized. Samson Thai's reign, lasting from 1373 to 1421, is remembered as one of the most prosperous periods in Lao history. Unlike his father, he understood that successful long-term rule required balancing competing interests and focusing on internal development rather than external conquest. He consolidated Lan Xang's gains, strengthened its institutions, and established the diplomatic relationships that would help the kingdom survive for centuries. Under Samson Thai, Lan Xang received formal recognition from the Ming Empire in China, which was crucial for the kingdom's international legitimacy and trade relationships. The Chinese court was always particular about acknowledging new kingdoms, and their official recognition opened up diplomatic and commercial opportunities throughout East and Southeast Asia. It was like getting a medieval good housekeeping seal of approval. The new king also married strategically, forming marriage alliances with the principal Thai kingdoms including Lanna and Ayutthaya. These weren't just romantic arrangements, but diplomatic treaties sealed with wedding ceremonies. Through these marriages, Samson Thai created a network of relationships that helped prevent conflicts and facilitated trade. Samson Thai's reign saw significant cultural development as well. The wealth generated by trade and tribute allowed for the construction of magnificent temples, the support of scholarly monks, and the development of distinctly Lao artistic traditions. Luang Prabang began to take on the appearance that would make it famous, a city where Buddhist spirituality and royal power were expressed through architecture that harmonized with the natural landscape. The king's death in 1421 marked the end of Lan Xang's first golden age, but it also established the kingdom's reputation as a significant regional power. Fa Ngum had created the structure, Samson Thai had made it work. Together, they had founded a kingdom that would endure for over 3 centuries and establish the cultural and political foundations for modern Laos. Chapter 3. Fragmentation and regional powers. The death of Samson-Thai in 1421 marked the end of Lan Xang's first golden age, but the kingdom was far from finished with making history. What followed was a pattern that would become depressingly familiar in Southeast Asian politics. Periods of brilliant leadership followed by succession crises, foreign invasions, and the occasional ruler who managed to put things back together again, at least temporarily. For the next 100 years, Lan Xang experienced what historians diplomatically call political instability, and what everyone else would recognize as a series of very messy family feuds played out on a national scale. Kings came and went with alarming frequency, sometimes lasting mere months before being deposed by relatives, rivals, or neighbors who thought they could do better. It was like a medieval reality TV show, except with more actual consequences and fewer commercial breaks. The kingdom's problems weren't entirely self-inflicted. The 16th century brought new challenges from increasingly powerful neighbors. The Burmese to the northwest were consolidating under strong rulers and eyeing Lan Xang's territories with the kind of interest that made diplomatic relations rather tense. Meanwhile, the Siamese kingdom of Ayutthaya continued to grow stronger and had never quite forgotten their old territorial disputes with the land of 1,000,000 elephants. Into this challenging environment stepped King Photissarath in 1520, a ruler who understood that Lan Xang needed both internal reform and external security if it was going to survive as an independent kingdom. His first major decision was moving the capital from Luang Prabang to Vientiane, a choice that made perfect strategic sense but probably caused significant grumbling among the court officials who had to pack up their entire lives and relocate downriver. Vientiane offered several advantages over the traditional capital. It was more centrally located within the kingdom's territories, making administration more efficient. It sat on better trade routes along the Mekong, which meant more customs revenue for the royal treasury. Most importantly, it was farther from the Burmese border and therefore less vulnerable to sudden invasion by ambitious neighbours with large armies and flexible concepts of sovereignty. Photissarath also made Buddhism the official state religion in 1527, formalizing what had been the kingdom's dominant faith since Fa Ngum's time. This wasn't just a spiritual decision but a political one. Official Buddhism meant standardized religious practices, centralized temple hierarchies, and a more unified cultural identity. It was nation-building through theological consistency, which sounds dry but actually worked quite well. The king's most consequential achievement was arranging for his son, Sethathirath, to become ruler of the northern Thai kingdom of Lanna. This was medieval diplomatic genius. Instead of fighting neighbouring kingdoms, why not just have your family rule them? When Photissarath died in 1548, his son inherited not one kingdom but two, creating what was briefly one of the largest unified states in Southeast Asian history. Sethathirath's reign from 1548 to 1571 represents Lan Xang's second golden age, though it was achieved under considerably more difficult circumstances than his predecessors had faced. The young king had to balance ruling two separate kingdoms while dealing with an increasingly aggressive Burma that viewed the Lao-Thai alliance as a direct threat to their own regional ambitions. Burma's concerns weren't entirely paranoid. A unified Lan Xang-Lanna alliance controlled trade routes, commanded substantial military resources, and represented exactly the kind of regional power bloc that ambitious Burmese kings preferred not to exist on their borders. When diplomacy failed to separate the two kingdoms, Burma resorted to the time-honoured tradition of invasion, which forced Sethathirath to make some hard choices about priorities. The Burmese campaigns of the 1560s and 70s put enormous strain on Lan Xang's resources. Fighting a major regional power required mobilizing the kingdom's entire military capacity, which meant diverting resources from trade, agriculture, and all the peaceful activities that actually made the kingdom prosperous. It was like trying to run a successful business while simultaneously fighting off hostile takeover attempts. Possible, but exhausting. Setthathirath managed to repel 2 major Burmese invasions, but the cost was significant. He was eventually forced to give up direct control of Lanna, choosing to focus his resources on defending Lan Xang proper rather than trying to maintain a 2-kingdom alliance that Burma was determined to break. It was a strategic retreat that probably saved Lan Xang from complete conquest, though it must have felt like failure at the time. The king's architectural legacy proved more enduring than his military campaigns. He built That Luang, the golden stupa that became Vientiane's most famous landmark and remains a symbol of Lao Buddhism to this day. He also constructed Wat Phra Kayu to house the Emerald Buddha, a sacred image that he brought from northern Thailand and which added considerable spiritual prestige to his capital city. These weren't just vanity projects, but calculated investments in soft power. Magnificent temples attracted pilgrims, which brought economic activity. Sacred Buddha images enhanced the kingdom's reputation among other Buddhist states. Beautiful architecture demonstrated prosperity and stability to visiting diplomats and merchants. It was tourism and international relations rolled into one impressive construction program. However, Setthathirath's reign ended abruptly and mysteriously in 1571, when he disappeared during a military campaign in Cambodia. Some sources suggest he died of illness, others hint at assassination, and a few optimistic chroniclers held out hope that he was simply lost in the jungle and might eventually return. He never did, leaving Lan Xang without clear leadership at a crucial moment in its history. The king's disappearance triggered another succession crisis that lasted for decades. Various princes, nobles, and ambitious relatives claimed the throne, often with backing from different foreign powers who saw opportunity in Lan Xang's internal chaos. Burma, Siam, and Vietnam all had their preferred candidates and weren't shy about providing military support to advance their interests. For over 60 years, from 1571 to 1637, Lan Xang struggled with political instability that weakened the kingdom and made it vulnerable to external manipulation. It was a period historians tend to describe with phrases like dynastic turmoil and contested succession, which sounds much more dignified than the reality of different armies marching back and forth across the country, installing and deposing kings depending on who had the most foreign backing that particular season. The chaos finally ended in 1637 with the accession of King Serene, whose 57-year reign would become the longest and most prosperous in Lao history. Serene understood that Lan Xang needed internal stability above all else, and he achieved it through a combination of firm authority, legal reform, and what modern political scientists might recognize as evidence-based governance. The new king's first priority was eliminating potential rivals to his throne. Rather than the usual medieval approach of public executions and dramatic confrontations, he chose exile and enforced religious retirement for his competitors. One brother was sent to Vietnam, another was strongly encouraged to become a monk, and various cousins found themselves appointed to distant administrative positions where they could contribute to the kingdom without threatening the royal succession. It was authoritarianism with good manners. Serene legal reforms became legendary throughout Southeast Asia. He established courts that treated nobles and commoners equally under the law, which was revolutionary for its time and place. The most famous example of his commitment to justice involved his own crown prince, who committed adultery with the wife of a court official. Rather than covering up the scandal or finding creative interpretations of the law, the king allowed his son to face the prescribed penalty, execution. This wasn't mere theatrical cruelty, but calculated political strategy. By demonstrating that royal family members were subject to the same laws as everyone else, Surinya built unprecedented public trust in his government. Ordinary citizens could pursue legal remedies against powerful nobles, knowing that the courts would actually consider their cases fairly. It was the rule of law in action, medieval Southeast Asian style. The king's personal lifestyle also contributed to his reputation for fairness and wisdom. Unlike many rulers of the period, he avoided ostentatious displays of wealth and power. European visitors noted that he wore simple clothing, sat on beautifully woven reed mats rather than elaborate thrones, and spent the kingdom's resources on religious buildings and public works rather than personal luxuries. He was like a Buddhist philosopher king, who actually managed to make philosophy and kingship work together. Under Surinya rule, Lan Xang experienced what contemporary observers called a golden age of prosperity and cultural achievement. The kingdom's monasteries became renowned centers of Buddhist learning, attracting scholars and monks from throughout Southeast Asia. European visitors compared Lan Xang's religious institutions to universities, noting that students came from as far away as Siam as to university. The Dutch merchant Gerrit van Weesthoff, who visited Vientiane in 1641, was particularly impressed by the kingdom's wealth and stability. His reports described bustling markets, extensive trade networks, and a level of prosperity that competed with the richest kingdoms in the region. The Italian Jesuit Giovanni Maria Leria, who spent 6 years in Laos during the 1640s, provided even more detailed accounts of a sophisticated society with impressive cultural achievements. These European visitors documented a kingdom that had successfully balanced international trade, religious scholarship, and political stability. Lan Xang controlled important overland trade routes between China and the southern kingdoms, generating substantial customs revenues. Its religious institutions attracted donations and pilgrims from across the Buddhist world. Its legal system provided predictable dispute resolution that facilitated business and social relationships. The kingdom's cultural flowering during this period produced lasting achievements in architecture, literature, and religious art. Temples built under Surinya patronage combined traditional Lao styles with influences from the broader Buddhist world, creating a distinctive architectural vocabulary that influenced building throughout the region. Court poets and chroniclers recorded myths, legends, and historical narratives that preserved Lao cultural identity for future generations. However, this golden age contained the seeds of its own destruction. Surinya execution of his crown prince left the kingdom without a clear heir, and the king's commitment to justice prevented him from simply changing the law to benefit his family. When he died in 1694 at the age of 81, having ruled for 57 years, he left behind grandsons and daughters but no adult male heir with an undisputed claim to the throne. The succession crisis that followed Surinya death was everything the kingdom had avoided during his long reign. His nephew, Prince Sayong Hu, seized control in Vientiane with Vietnamese military support, effectively making Lan Xang a Vietnamese client state. The late king's grandsons, Prince Kinkitsarat and Prince Inthasom, fled into exile in Sipsong Pana, while Princess Sumangala retreated to Champasak in the south. This wasn't just a family feud, but a fundamental break in the kingdom's political structure. For over 3 centuries, Lan Xang had maintained at least nominal unity under a single royal dynasty. The succession dispute of 1694 shattered that continuity and opened the door for regional powers to pursue their own interests in what had been unified Lao territory. In 1705, Prince Kinkitsarat decided to reclaim his inheritance by force. With support from his uncle in Sipsong Pana, he marched on Luang Prabang and managed to capture the old royal capital. Rather than unifying the kingdom under his rule, however, this military success simply formalized its division. By 1707, Lan Xang had officially split into two separate kingdoms, Luang Prabang in the north under King Kitsurat, and Vientiane in the centre under Sayong Hu. Princess Sumangala's decision to establish independent rule in Champasak completed the fragmentation in 1713. The southern kingdom was smaller and weaker than its northern counterparts, but it represented the final dissolution of the unified state that Fa Ngum had created nearly 4 centuries earlier. The land of 1,000,000 elephants now existed only in memory and in the cultural traditions that all 3 successor kingdoms claimed to inherit. The division wasn't just political but practical. Trade routes that had been internal now crossed international borders. Military resources were divided among 3 separate royal courts. Religious institutions lost the unified patronage that had supported major construction projects and scholarly exchange. What had been the kingdom's greatest strength, its size and integration, became its greatest weakness when that unity could no longer be maintained. Each of the 3 new kingdoms faced challenges that a unified Lan Xang might have managed more effectively. Luang Prabang, despite its historical prestige as the original royal capital, was geographically isolated and economically limited. Vientiane controlled better trade routes and more fertile agricultural land, but its dependence on Vietnamese support compromised its independence. Champasak was smallest of all and vulnerable to pressure from both Siam and Cambodia. The timing of this division was particularly unfortunate because regional power dynamics were shifting in ways that favoured larger, more unified states. The 18th century would see increasingly aggressive competition between Burma and Siam for control of mainland Southeast Asia, with smaller kingdoms forced to choose sides or face conquest. A united Lan Xang might have maintained its independence through careful diplomacy and military strength. 3 separate Lao kingdoms were much more vulnerable to external pressure and internal manipulation. The cultural legacy of unified Lan Xang survived its political fragmentation, but the practical advantages of size, coordination, and unified leadership were lost forever. The 3 successor kingdoms would continue to claim legitimacy from their connection to the great kingdom of Fa Ngum and Serene Vongsa, but they would never again achieve the regional influence and internal stability that had made Lan Xang one of Southeast Asia's most successful medieval states. By 1707, the age of Lan Xang was over, and the age of smaller, more vulnerable Lao kingdoms had begun. The 1,000,000 elephants were now divided into smaller herds, each trying to find its own way through an increasingly dangerous political landscape where powerful neighbours saw opportunity in disunity and weakness in division. Chapter 4: Colonial Encounter and French Protectorate. By the middle of the 19th century, the 3 kingdoms that had emerged from Lan Xang's division were learning that independence in Southeast Asia was becoming increasingly complicated. The world beyond the Mekong was changing rapidly, with European powers carving up territories and drawing new maps that often ignored inconvenient local details like existing kingdoms, traditional boundaries, and the preferences of people who actually lived there. The French had arrived in Southeast Asia with the usual colonial combination of commercial ambition, missionary zeal, and strategic anxiety about what their European competitors might be doing. They'd already established themselves in southern Vietnam and Cambodia, and they were casting increasingly interested glances at the Lao territories to the west. Their initial excuse was wonderfully bureaucratic. Since Vietnam had historically exercised some influence over parts of Laos, and France now controlled Vietnam, surely that meant France inherited Vietnam's traditional rights in Lao affairs. This was the kind of legal logic that sounds almost reasonable until you think about it for more than 30 seconds. It It was like claiming you could inherit your neighbour's occasional borrowing privileges when you bought their house. But colonial powers had never let minor details like logical consistency interfere with territorial ambitions, and France was no exception to this pattern. The first serious French exploration of Lao territory came in 1867 with the Mekong Exploration Commission, led by Ernest Dudart de Lagre and Francis Garnier. Their official mission was to determine whether the Mekong River could serve as a trade route to China, which would have been tremendously valuable for French commercial interests. Their unofficial mission was to map the region, assess its resources, and evaluate its potential for French expansion. The expedition spent 4 weeks in Luang Prabang, where they encountered the first significant town upstream from Phnom Penh. The team's artist, Louis Delaporte, made detailed drawings that provide some of our earliest visual records of the royal city's architecture and daily life. They also discovered something wonderfully unexpected: Henri Mouhot's dog, Tine Tine, still alive and well and being cared for by a Lao family 6 years after the French explorer's death. It was a small reminder that cross-cultural kindness often flourished even in times of political tension. The expedition's commercial conclusions were disappointing for French planners. The Mekong's numerous rapids made it completely unsuitable as a regular trade route, a fact that became obvious after just 3 months of exploration, though the team gamely continued mapping for another 1.5 years. But the geographic and political intelligence they gathered proved far more valuable than any potential shipping lane. The French learned that the Lao kingdoms were wealthy, strategically located, and vulnerable to external pressure. The kingdoms controlled important overland trade routes, possessed fertile agricultural land, and lacked the military resources to resist a determined European power. Most importantly, they were caught between competing regional powers, Siam and Vietnam, which meant France could potentially exploit these divisions to establish influence without facing united resistance. The man who would orchestrate France's entry into Laos was Auguste Pavier, a colonial civil servant whose background was about as unimpressive as possible for someone destined to reshape regional geopolitics. Born the son of a cabinet maker in Brittany, Pavie had no formal diplomatic training, no military academy credentials, and no connections among the French colonial elite. What he did have was an extraordinary talent for languages, an instinctive understanding of local politics, and the kind of patient persistence that colonial administrators either developed or failed completely in their assignments. Pavie first attracted attention while building telegraph lines in Cambodia and Cochinchina during the 1870s. He received criticism from other French officials for going native, immersing himself in local culture, learning languages fluently, and treating indigenous people as something other than obstacles to efficient administration. But his superiors couldn't argue with his results. Telegraph lines that actually worked, local cooperation that made construction possible, and intelligence networks that provided valuable political information. In 1886, following diplomatic negotiations that Siam had little choice but to accept, France established a vice-consulate in Luang Prabang. The position went to Pavier, who understood that his real job wasn't issuing visas or filing commercial reports, but gradually shifting the kingdom's orientation from Siamese to French influence. It was diplomacy as patient cultivation, the kind of work that required understanding local sensitivities and building genuine relationships rather than simply issuing demands. Pavier's opportunity to demonstrate French usefulness came in 1887 when Chinese bandit groups known as the Black Flag Army attacked Luang Prabang. These weren't random raiders but organized forces connected to broader regional conflicts involving Chinese resistance to French expansion in northern Vietnam. The attack on Luang Prabang was partly retaliation for Siamese cooperation with French policies, and partly an attempt to seize valuable territory during a period of regional instability. The assault was devastating. The royal palace was burned, hundreds of residents were killed, and King Lan Xang barely escaped with his life. Pavienne's staff organised the king's evacuation, arranging boats and guides for a dangerous journey down the Mekong to safety in Bangkok. It was exactly the kind of dramatic rescue that creates lasting political gratitude, and Pavi understood the implications immediately. When King Lan Xang returned to rebuild his capital, he carried with him a French promise of protection against future attacks. This wasn't just diplomatic courtesy, but practical insurance. If Chinese bandits or other external forces threatened Luang Prabang again, French military resources would be available to defend the kingdom. For a small state surrounded by larger, more powerful neighbours, this kind of security guarantee was extremely attractive. The formal Protectorate Treaty was signed in 1889, making Luang Prabang officially a French protected kingdom. The arrangement preserved the monarchy's internal autonomy while giving France control over foreign relations and defence. It was colonialism with a light touch, at least initially, designed to provide France with influence without the expense and complications of direct rule. However, the broader regional situation was moving toward crisis. Siam controlled the other two Lao kingdoms, Vientiane and Champasak, and had no intention of watching France gradually absorb all the territories that had once comprised Lan Xang. French and Siamese officials engaged in an escalating series of diplomatic incidents, territorial disputes, and competing claims that made armed conflict increasingly likely. The crisis reached its peak in 1893 when France decided to resolve the situation through what diplomatic historians call gunboat diplomacy, but which everyone else would recognize as military. Intimidation. French warships sailed up the Chao Phraya River and anchored off Bangkok, their guns trained on the Siamese capital, while French diplomats presented an ultimatum: cede all Lao territories east of the Mekong River to French control, or face bombardment and possible invasion. It was effective, if not particularly subtle. Siam, despite having a larger population and more extensive military resources than the Lao kingdoms, could not match French naval technology and European military organisation. King Chulalongkorn chose to preserve his kingdom's independence by sacrificing territories he'd never controlled as securely as his own heartland. The October 3rd Treaty formally transferred Siamese suzerainty over the eastern Lao kingdoms to French protection. The establishment of the French Protectorate of Laos in 1893 marked the beginning of 60 years of colonial rule that would reshape Lao society in ways that continue to influence the country today. France combined the three former kingdoms, Luang Prabang, Vientiane, and Champasak, into a single administrative entity for the first time since Lan Xang's division over 2 centuries earlier. The French gave this reunified territory its modern name, Laos. The choice reflected typical colonial simplification. Rather than dealing with multiple kingdoms with their own histories and identities, French administrators preferred a single designation based on the dominant ethnic group. It was administratively convenient, though it glossed over the complex relationships between different Lao communities and the various ethnic minorities who also lived in the region. Colonial administration in Laos followed the French Indochina pattern established in Vietnam and Cambodia. The territory became one of 5 components of French Indochina, alongside the Vietnamese regions of Tonkin, Annam, and Cochinchina, plus Cambodia. However, Laos occupied a distinctly secondary position within this colonial federation. French officials in Saigon and Paris viewed it as little more than a buffer territory, protecting their more valuable Vietnamese possessions from British influence in Burma and continuing Siamese expansion. This peripheral status meant that French investment in Laos remained limited throughout the colonial period. Unlike Vietnam, which received substantial infrastructure development and industrial investment, Laos was treated primarily as a source of raw materials and a strategic buffer zone. The colonial administration built some roads, established telegraph communications, and created administrative centres, but these projects were modest compared to French development efforts elsewhere in Indochina. The administrative structure reflected French preferences for centralised control combined with practical concessions to local conditions. Vientiane became the colonial capital, housing the resident superior who reported to the Governor-General in Hanoi and exercised executive authority throughout the Protectorate. The kingdom of Luang Prabang retained nominal autonomy under its traditional monarch, but real power rested with French officials who controlled finance, foreign relations, and major policy decisions. French colonial policy in Laos emphasized indirect rule through existing traditional structures, modified to serve colonial purposes. The traditional Khao Muang system, where hereditary Lao nobles served as district administrators, was preserved but subordinated to French oversight. Local officials could continue managing routine affairs and collecting taxes, but major decisions required French approval and policy had to conform to colonial objectives. One of the most significant changes involved personnel. French administrators relied heavily on Vietnamese clerks, interpreters, and minor officials to staff the colonial bureaucracy. This created what scholars call an ethnic hierarchy that placed French officials at the top, Vietnamese intermediaries in the middle, and Lao people at the bottom of the administrative structure. The arrangement was efficient from a colonial perspective, but generated lasting resentment among Lao communities who found themselves governed through Vietnamese intermediaries. The economic impact of colonial rule was mixed, but generally limited. France established monopolies on salt, alcohol, and opium that generated revenue for colonial projects but also imposed new tax burdens on local communities. The head tax system required cash payments that forced many Lao farmers into market economies for the first time, as they needed to sell agricultural products to pay colonial taxes. However, unlike some colonial territories, Laos didn't experience massive economic disruption or widespread landlessness. Most Lao farmers continued subsistence rice cultivation supplemented by market sales, while upland communities could sell forest products or opium to meet tax obligations. The colonial economy created new obligations and opportunities, but didn't fundamentally restructure traditional livelihoods. French cultural policy in Laos was notably restrained compared to colonial practices elsewhere. The administration made few attempts to impose French language or culture on the general population, focusing instead on training a small Lao elite who could serve as intermediaries between colonial officials and local communities. Catholic missionary activity was permitted, but achieved minimal success against the deeply established Buddhist religious culture. The colonial period did introduce significant changes to traditional authority structures. Buddhist monasteries, which had served as centres of education and cultural preservation, found their influence gradually circumscribed by French administrative systems. Traditional law was replaced by French legal codes in many areas, though religious and family matters often remained under customary jurisdiction. Perhaps most importantly, French rule imposed artificial unity on territories that had been politically divided for over 2 centuries. The colonial administration treated Luang Prabang, Vientiane, and Champasak as components of a single entity, gradually creating administrative, economic, and communication networks that reconnected regions that had developed separately since Lan Xang's fragmentation. This reunification was largely administrative rather than cultural or political. Local identities and traditional loyalties remained strong, and many Lao people continued to identify primarily with their specific regions rather than with Laos as a unified entity. But the colonial period established institutional frameworks and territorial boundaries that would provide the foundation for modern Laos statehood after independence. By the 1920s and 30s, French rule in Laos had settled into a predictable routine of limited development, routine administration, and general neglect by higher colonial authorities more interested in Vietnam's industrial potential and Cambodia's agricultural wealth. The Protectorate functioned adequately but never fulfilled early French hopes for significant economic returns or strategic importance. This colonial period of relative stability would end abruptly with the outbreak of World War II and the arrival of Japanese forces in Southeast Asia. But for nearly 5 decades, French rule provided Laos with its first experience of centralized government since Lan Xang's division, creating both the institutional foundations and the political grievances that would shape the country's struggle for independence. Chapter 5: Independence, Struggles and Civil War. The relative stability of French colonial rule in Laos came to an abrupt end with World War II and the arrival of Japanese forces in Southeast Asia. Like many colonial territories during the war, Laos found itself caught between competing imperial powers with very different ideas about its future. The Japanese forced the French colonial administration aside and compelled King Sisavang to declare independence in April 1945, though this independence meant simply exchanging French control for Japanese oversight. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Laos faced the classic post-war colonial dilemma. Nobody was quite sure who was supposed to be in charge. The French wanted to reassert their colonial authority. Various Lao political groups had their own ideas about independence, and neighbouring powers were positioning themselves to influence whatever government emerged from the chaos. It was the kind of situation that looks simple on paper but becomes remarkably complicated when everyone involved has different definitions of legitimacy. The most significant development during this confused period was the formation of the Lao Isara, or Free Laos movement, in October 1945. This nationalist organisation brought together various anti-colonial groups under the leadership of Prince Phetsarath, who had served as Prime Minister during the brief Japanese-sponsored independence period. The movement included his half-brothers Prince Suvarnabhumi and Prince Suphanuvong, creating a royal coalition that gave the independence movement considerable legitimacy. However, the French had no intention of simply walking away from their Indochina territories. They returned with military force in 1946, using paratroopers, artillery and aircraft to defeat the Lao Isara forces and re-establish colonial control. It was a textbook demonstration of how European powers intended to handle post-war decolonization by pretending it wasn't happening and using whatever force was necessary to maintain the status quo. The defeated Lao Isara leaders fled to Bangkok, where they spent the next few years in exile, planning their return and arguing among themselves about strategy and ideology. These internal debates would prove crucial for Laos's future, because the three royal brothers gradually developed very different ideas about how to achieve genuine independence and what kind of country Laos should become once it was free of foreign control. Prince Suvarnabhumi emerged as the moderate voice, advocating for neutrality and non-alignment in the developing Cold War. He believed Laos could achieve independence through negotiation and diplomacy, maintaining good relations with all major powers while avoiding entanglement in their ideological conflicts. It was a reasonable position that unfortunately assumed other countries would respect Laos's desire to remain neutral, which turned out to be wildly optimistic. Prince Suphanuvong took a more radical approach, becoming increasingly influenced by communist ideology and forming close connections with Ho Chi Minh's Vietnamese independence movement. He believed that genuine independence required revolutionary change and alignment with the communist bloc, which would provide the military and economic support necessary to resist Western imperialism. His followers would later nickname him the Red Prince, though probably not to his face. The third brother, Prince Fetzerath, found himself caught between these competing visions, trying to maintain unity within the exile movement, while the Cold War gradually polarized Southeast Asian politics. By the early 1950s, it was becoming clear that the middle ground he represented was disappearing as regional conflicts forced countries to choose sides in the global ideological struggle. Meanwhile, the French were discovering that colonial restoration was more expensive and complicated than they'd anticipated. The war in Vietnam was absorbing enormous resources, and maintaining control over Laos required military commitments that France could ill afford. Pressure from the United States, which was funding French operations but preferred politically reliable allies to colonial subjects, added to the incentive for some form of negotiated settlement. In October 1953, France signed the Franco-Lao Treaty of Amity and Association, which granted Laos full independence while maintaining certain French privileges and establishing the country as a constitutional monarchy. King Sisavang became head of state, and the various exile factions were invited to return and participate in the new government. It was independence with extensive fine print, but it was still independence. However, not everyone was included in this political settlement. Prince Suphanuvong and his communist-oriented followers had by this time formed the Pathet Lao, or Lao Nation, which operated as the Laotian branch of the broader Vietnamese independence movement. They controlled significant territory in the northern and eastern provinces, and had no intention of accepting a political system that excluded them from power or compromised their revolutionary goals. The result was the kind of complicated, multi-sided conflict that became depressingly common during the Cold War. Laos officially gained independence in 1953, but immediately found itself divided among three main political factions: the neutralists under Prince Suvarnabhumi, the right-wing royalists under Prince Baon Om of Champasak, and the communist Pathet Lao under Prince Suphanuvong. Each faction had external supporters, different visions for the country's future, and decreasing interest in compromise. The neutralists controlled the official government in Vientiane and genuinely tried to implement the kind of non-aligned foreign policy that might have kept Laos out of Cold War conflicts. Prince Suvarnabhumi repeatedly attempted to form coalition governments that would include all factions and allow the country to focus on development rather than ideological struggle. These efforts showed admirable optimism but consistently failed when confronted with the reality that other countries had their own plans for Laos. The royalist faction, based in the south around Champasak, received support from Thailand and increasingly from the United States, which viewed any communist presence in Southeast Asian governments as unacceptable. The royalists controlled the official military, the Royal Lao Army, and had access to American weapons, training and financial support. They represented the closest thing to an anti-communist government that American policymakers could support in Laos. The Pathet Lao, meanwhile, received extensive support from North Vietnam and China, including weapons, training, military advisors, and eventually regular troops. They controlled much of the mountainous terrain along the Vietnamese border and had strong support among ethnic minorities who had been marginalized under traditional Lao political systems. For them, the struggle wasn't just about independence from France, but about fundamental social revolution. By the late 1950s, this three-way political competition had escalated into armed conflict. The Pathet Lao launched military campaigns to expand their territory and challenge the royal government's authority. The Royal Lao Army, despite American support, proved unable to effectively counter Pathet Lao guerrilla tactics in difficult mountain terrain. Coalition governments formed and collapsed with depressing regularity as each faction manoeuvred for advantage. The situation became further complicated in 1960 when Captain Kong Le, a neutralist paratrooper commander, staged a coup and seized control of Vientiane. Kong Le's forces represented soldiers who were tired of fighting other Laotians and wanted the country to pursue genuine neutrality rather than becoming a battleground for foreign powers. Unfortunately, his coup only added another military faction to an already complex conflict. The Geneva Conference of 1961 to 1962 attempted to resolve the crisis through international negotiation. The resulting Geneva Accords established Laos as a neutral state and created yet another coalition government, this time with formal international guarantees. On paper, it looked like a reasonable solution. Laos would remain neutral, foreign military forces would withdraw, and the three factions would share power in a genuinely representative government. In practice, the Geneva Accords were violated almost immediately by all parties. North Vietnam continued using Laotian territory for the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply route that carried men and materials from North Vietnam to support communist forces in South Vietnam. The United States began covert operations to support anti-communist factions and interdict communist supply lines. The Soviet Union provided weapons and advisors to the Pathet Lao. The neutral coalition government existed mainly on paper while the real conflict continued in the countryside. What followed was one of the most intensive bombing campaigns in human history, conducted by the United States against what was officially a neutral country. From 1964 to 1973, American aircraft dropped over 2 million tons of bombs on Laos, more than all the bombs dropped during World War II combined. The campaign included over 580,000 bombing missions, which works out to one bombing mission every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 9 years. This became known as the Secret War, because the American government never officially acknowledged the extent of its military operations in Laos. The bombing was conducted covertly, using civilian contractors and volunteer pilots to maintain plausible deniability about American involvement. It was secrecy through semantic technicalities. The operations weren't secret from the Laotians being bombed, just from the American public and Congress who were funding them. The primary targets were the Ho Chi Minh Trail and areas controlled by the Pathet Lao, but the intensive bombing inevitably affected civilian populations throughout eastern and northern Laos. Villages were destroyed, agricultural areas were contaminated with unexploded ordnance, and thousands of Laotians were killed or displaced. The bombing made large areas of the country uninhabitable and created refugee populations that overwhelmed the government's capacity to provide assistance. The human cost of this campaign was enormous and continues to affect Laos today. Unexploded cluster bombs, scattered across the countryside like deadly seeds, still kill and maim Laotians decades after the war ended. The bombs were designed to scatter hundreds of small bomblets over wide areas, creating long-lasting hazards that interfere with farming, construction, and daily life. Laos became, and remains, the most heavily bombed country per capita in world history. The CIA also recruited ethnic minorities, particularly the Hmong people, to fight a guerrilla war against Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese forces. The Hmong, led by General Vang Pao, proved to be effective fighters in the mountainous terrain and became America's primary indigenous allies in the conflict. This alliance provided the United States with local knowledge and manpower, while giving the Hmong access to modern weapons and American support for their own political objectives. However, this partnership also made the Hmong targets for reprisals when the war ended. Their alliance with the CIA marked them as collaborators, in the eyes of the eventual Pathet Lao government, leading to persecution, displacement, and refugee flight that continued for years after 1975. The CIA's recruitment of ethnic minorities created obligations that the United States struggled to fulfill when the war ended unfavorably. Despite the massive American bombing campaign and extensive covert operations, the Pathet Lao gradually gained control over larger portions of Laotian territory. North Vietnamese support provided them with regular military units, modern weapons, and strategic coordination that the Royal Lao Army, despite American aid, could not match. The bombing disrupted communist operations but could not eliminate them entirely, particularly in the remote mountainous areas where the Pathet Lao was strongest. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973, which ended direct American involvement in Vietnam, also led to a ceasefire in Laos. The Vientiane Agreement, signed in February 1973, created yet another coalition government and called for the withdrawal of foreign forces. But like previous agreements, this settlement failed to address the fundamental incompatibility between the different factions' goals for Laos's future. As American support diminished and North Vietnamese backing continued, the balance of power shifted decisively toward the Pathet Lao. The fall of Saigon in April 1975 demonstrated that the United States would not intervene to save anti-communist governments in Indochina, undermining the morale and political position of the Royal Lao government. Right-wing and neutralist politicians began fleeing the country as Pathet Lao forces advanced toward Vientiane. On December 2, 1975, the Pathet Lao proclaimed the establishment of the Lao People's Democratic Republic, ending the 6th-century-old monarchy and bringing communist rule to Laos. King Sisavangvathana abdicated, and many members of the royal family were sent to re-education camps in remote areas where most of them died under harsh conditions. The revolution had succeeded, but at enormous cost to Laotian society and the Laotian people. The victory of the Pathet Lao marked the end of Laos's brief and tumultuous experience with independence and democracy. From 1953 to 1975, the country had struggled to establish stable government and national unity while serving as a proxy battleground for Cold War superpowers. The effort failed, leaving Laos devastated by war, divided by political conflict, and facing the challenge of rebuilding under a revolutionary government aligned with the communist bloc. Chapter 6: Modern Laos and Contemporary Challenges. The establishment of the Lao People's Democratic Republic in December 1975 marked not just the end of 6 centuries of monarchy, but the beginning of one of the most dramatic social and economic transformations in Southeast Asian history. The Pathet Lao, now reorganized as the Lao People's Revolutionary Party, faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding a country devastated by war, while simultaneously creating an entirely new political and economic system based on Marxist-Leninist principles. The new government's initial approach followed the classic socialist playbook: nationalization of industry, collectivization of agriculture, and the establishment of a one-party state with centralized control over all aspects of society. It was ambitious social engineering on a massive scale, attempting to transform a predominantly rural Buddhist society into a modern socialist state within a matter of years. The fact that this had never been successfully accomplished anywhere else in quite the same circumstances apparently wasn't considered a major obstacle. The human cost of this transformation was immediate and substantial. Former members of the Royal Lao Army, government officials, and anyone associated with the previous regime were sent to re-education camps in remote areas of the country. These facilities, which housed perhaps 30,000 people at their peak, were designed to transform reactionary elements into productive socialist citizens through a combination of manual labour, political education, and what modern human rights observers would recognise as systematic abuse. Many of those sent to re-education camps never returned. The conditions were harsh, food was scarce, and medical care was virtually non-existent. The royal family, including King Sisavangvatana and Queen Kamfui, disappeared into the camp system and died under circumstances that remain officially unclear. It was revolutionary justice administered with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that makes tragic historical episodes particularly heartbreaking. The broader population faced their own challenges, as the new government attempted to restructure traditional economic relationships. Agricultural collectivization programs aimed to replace family farming with cooperative production, while urban commerce was brought under state control. For a society that had operated on personal relationships and traditional exchange systems for centuries, these changes represented a fundamental disruption of daily life and economic survival. Not surprisingly, many Laotians decided that life under the new system wasn't for them. By 1980, approximately 10% of the country's population, roughly 300,000 people, had fled across the Mekong River to refugee camps in Thailand. This exodus included educated professionals, former military officers, ethnic minorities who had allied with the Americans, and ordinary families who simply wanted to escape the uncertainty and hardship of revolutionary transformation. The refugee crisis created both a humanitarian emergency and a brain drain that would affect Laos for decades. Thailand found itself hosting hundreds of thousands of Laotian refugees, while countries like the United States, France, and Australia eventually resettled many of them permanently. The Lao diaspora that resulted from this period continues to influence global perceptions of the country and maintains cultural connections that complicate simple narratives about the revolution's success. Meanwhile, the Lao economy under socialist management was struggling with problems that would have been familiar to central planners from Moscow to Havana. Agricultural production declined as farmers resisted collectivization. Industrial output remained minimal because there hadn't been much industry to nationalize in the first place. Foreign trade virtually disappeared as Western countries imposed sanctions, and the Soviet bloc proved to be an inadequate substitute for traditional trading partners. By the mid-1980s, it was becoming clear that ideological purity and economic functionality were proving difficult to reconcile. The leadership, led by Party General Secretary Kaesone Phomvihane, began quietly reassessing their approach. The Chinese were experimenting with market reforms under Deng Xiaoping. The Vietnamese were implementing their own version of economic liberalization, and even the Soviet Union was beginning to discuss perestroika. Laos was surrounded by examples of communist parties that were rethinking their economic strategies. In 1986, the Lao People's Revolutionary Party announced the New Economic Mechanism, or NEM, a comprehensive reform program that marked Laos's transition from a centrally planned economy to what officials diplomatically called a market-oriented economy under socialist direction. This was bureaucratic, language for capitalism with communist characteristics, or, as critics might have put it, admitting that the previous system wasn't working without actually saying so. The reforms were dramatic and far-reaching. Agricultural collectives were dissolved, and farmers were allowed to return to family-based production and sell their surplus on free markets. Private enterprise was legalized, foreign investment was welcomed, and state-owned enterprises were gradually privatized or allowed to operate according to market principles. It was perestroika with Lao characteristics, implemented with the same quiet pragmatism that had characterized much of the country's historical adaptation to changing circumstances. The results were encouraging, particularly compared to the economic stagnation of the previous decade. agricultural production increased as farmers responded to market incentives. Small businesses began appearing in towns and cities, providing goods and services that the state sector had been unable to supply effectively. Foreign investors, primarily from Thailand and other ASEAN countries, began exploring opportunities in a country that had been largely closed to external economic participation for over a decade. One of the most significant policy changes was Laos's decision to engage with regional and international organizations after years of isolation. In 1997, the country joined the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, marking its integration into the region's economic and political networks. ASEAN membership provided access to larger markets, investment opportunities, and diplomatic support for continued reforms. The timing of ASEAN membership proved challenging, however, as it coincided with the Asian financial crisis of 1997 to 1998. The crisis affected Laos less severely than some of its neighbours, partly because its economy was still relatively isolated from global financial markets, but it nonetheless highlighted the risks of economic integration and the need for sound fiscal management as the country opened to international markets. Tourism emerged as one of the most promising sectors for economic development during this period. Laos possessed exactly the kind of authentic cultural attractions and unspoiled natural beauty that international tourists were increasingly seeking. The ancient royal capital of Luang Prabang, with its stunning Buddhist temples and French colonial architecture, was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1995, providing international recognition and tourism marketing opportunities. The development of tourism required significant investment in infrastructure and services, but the returns proved substantial. From modest beginnings in the early 1990s, tourism revenue grew from $73.7 million in 1997 to over $1.7 billion by 2024. The sector became the country's third largest source of export earnings and a major employer, particularly in areas that had limited alternative economic opportunities. However, tourism also highlighted some of the contradictions and challenges facing modern Laos. The industry brought foreign currency and international exposure, but it also created economic inequalities and cultural tensions. Tourism jobs were often seasonal and low paid, while the benefits frequently accrued to foreign investors and urban entrepreneurs rather than rural communities. Managing tourism growth while preserving the cultural authenticity and environmental quality that attracted visitors in the first place became an ongoing challenge. The country's infrastructure development accelerated during the 2010 years, driven by Chinese investment under the Belt and Road Initiative. The most visible symbol of this partnership was the China-Laos Railway, completed in 2021, which connects Vientiane to Kunming and represents the first modern railway system in Laotian history. The project cost over $5.9 billion and required extensive Chinese financing, making it both a symbol of modern development and a source of concern about debt sustainability. Indeed, debt management has become one of the most pressing contemporary challenges facing Laos. The country's external debt reached approximately 125% of GDP by 2023, largely due to infrastructure projects and hydropower development financed by Chinese and other foreign creditors. While these investments have improved connectivity and economic capacity, they have also created fiscal pressures that limit the government's policy options and raise questions about long-term economic sovereignty. The political system established in 1975 has shown remarkable stability, with the Lao People's Revolutionary Party maintaining uninterrupted control for nearly 50 years. Leadership transitions have been managed smoothly, with power passing from the revolutionary generation to younger officials who have maintained policy continuity while adapting to changing circumstances. The party has successfully balanced maintaining political control with implementing economic reforms that have improved living standards and reduced absolute poverty. However, this political stability has come at the cost of limited political freedoms and civil society space. The party tolerates little dissent, and independent media, political opposition, and civil society organizations operate under significant constraints. Corruption remains a persistent problem, particularly in connection with resource extraction and large infrastructure projects, though the government has made efforts to address the most egregious abuses through anti-corruption campaigns and institutional reforms. One of the most persistent legacies of the secret war continues to affect daily life in rural areas: unexploded ordnance contamination. Decades after the bombing ended, cluster bombs and other explosive devices still kill and injure Laotians, limit agricultural development, and impede infrastructure construction. International organizations estimate that 37% of farmland remains unsafe due to UXO contamination, representing an enormous drag on economic development in a country where 70% of the population depends on agriculture. Clearance efforts have made significant progress, with international support from countries including the United States, which has contributed over $200 million to UXO removal programs since 1995. However, the scale of contamination means that complete clearance will require decades of continued effort and international cooperation. It's a uniquely tragic form of environmental degradation that serves as a daily reminder of conflicts that ended generations ago. Laos joined the World Trade Organization in 2013, marking another milestone in its integration into the global economy. WTO membership required extensive legal and regulatory reforms to bring the country's trade practices into compliance with international standards. The process was lengthy and complex, but it provided access to global markets and dispute resolution mechanisms while requiring greater transparency in economic policy making. The country's development strategy increasingly emphasizes graduating from least developed country status, which it has held since the United Nations created that classification. Graduation would represent recognition of significant economic and social progress, but it would also mean the loss of certain trade preferences and aid eligibilities that have supported development efforts. The government is targeting graduation by 2026, though achieving this goal will require sustained economic growth and continued progress in education, healthcare, and institutional development. Climate change presents both challenges and opportunities for modern Laos. The country is particularly vulnerable to extreme weather events, including floods and droughts that affect agricultural production and rural livelihoods. However, Laos also possesses enormous potential for renewable energy development, particularly hydropower, which could provide clean electricity for domestic use and export to neighbouring countries. The development of hydropower resources has become a major economic sector, but it has also generated environmental and social controversies. Large dam projects can provide significant revenue and improve energy security, but they also affect river ecosystems, displace communities, and alter traditional livelihoods. Balancing economic development with environmental sustainability and social equity has become one of the defining challenges of contemporary Laotian governance. Looking toward the future, Laos faces the challenge of diversifying its economy beyond resource extraction and low-skilled manufacturing toward higher-value activities that can provide better employment opportunities and more sustainable development. This transition requires continued investment in education, technology, and institutional capacity, as well as policies that support entrepreneurship and innovation while maintaining social cohesion and environmental quality. The story of modern Laos is ultimately one of adaptation and resilience. From the ashes of a devastating civil war, the country has built stable institutions, achieved significant economic growth, and maintained its cultural identity while engaging with the broader world. The challenges are real and substantial: debt sustainability, political freedoms, environmental protection, and economic inequality all require ongoing attention and creative solutions. But perhaps most remarkably, Laos has managed to preserve much of what made the ancient land of 1,000,000 elephants distinctive: the gentle rhythms of rural life, the central role of Buddhism in daily culture, and the quiet dignity with which Laotians navigate change while maintaining their essential character. The elephants themselves may be fewer in number now, but the spirit that created their legendary kingdom continues to guide this small nation as it finds its place in an increasingly connected and complex world.